I was saying this a little bit before everybody arrived, but I do have some prepared questions, and then I'm going to leave some time for audience questions at the end. I'll try to cue various people to answer questions, just to hopefully make things easier. But if you have something that you want to add, feel free to just wave, and the floor will be yours. I guess I will start. I'm AC Wise. I am the moderator, and I will throw it over to Ken since his square is right next to mine on my screen. And we can
Hi,
just
everyone.
clockwise.
We'll go clockwise with me. Hi, I'm Ken Liu. I'm the author of the Dandelion Dynasty series of epic fantasy books, and my latest short fiction collection is called The Hidden Girl and Other Stories. Really happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
I'm Rachel Hartman. I'm the author of 3 young adult fantasy novels. The first 2, Seraphina and Shadow Scale, are a duology about a half-dragon girl in a medievalish world, and then the third one takes place in the same world, and it's about Seraphina's fully human half-sister and her adventures. It's called Test of the Road. It's going to be a duology too, even though I hate duologies and I swore off them, but I somehow got looped into it. I don't know how that happens to me. So, but the second one, Test of the Road, is on the 6th draft, I think. So in principle, I don't have too many more drafts left of me. So.
Hi everyone, I'm SL Huang, or Lisa, and I am the author of the Cass Russell series from Tor Books, which is about a superheroine, an anti-heroine who can do math really, really fast, and she uses it to kill a lot of people, as you do with math. And I'm also the author of the upcoming fantasy Burning Roses, also from Tor. And I'm excited to talk to you all today.
Excellent. So we're here to talk about building characters. So my first question for all of you is, where do you start when building characters, or when building your story in general? Do you start with the characters? Do you start with the world and sort of fit the characters into that? What is generally your first step? And let's start with Rachel this time.
All right. I actually did start with the world. I don't know that in general that is going to be my usual way to start, but the world has been with me since I was 12, so it was already there, and so just finding people to live in it was not hard then, and I feel like it's a place where I can tell almost any kind of story that might occur to me, because it's very large, or has grown very large over the years. Test of the Road, though, for sure started with character, because the first idea I had for it was after having written Seraphina, and Seraphina, being and she saves the world. She's a good fantasy heroine, and I was like, what about her little sisters, though? And what if you got to be about 17, and by that age your older sister had already saved the world? Would you feel like a loser? So that was just the incipient question to set her off, I guess, on her own journey. And what is that like, trying to find yourself when in the shadow of someone who's done remarkable things?
Let's go to SL.
Sounds good.
Lisa or SL?
Either one. I'll respond to anything. I'll respond to hey you person. I always start with character. I know this varies by author. For me, I have to have an engaging character, and that's what drives the story for me. And if I don't, it just sort of peters out and won't go anywhere. And the world and the plot sort of start coalescing as I send this character out on with adventures and motivations and problems, and things all kind of build from there. So usually when I start writing, I have a concept of like 1 or 2, or sometimes even 3 or 4 really strong impressions of characters that I want to throw together in some like way that's very bad for all of them. And then I just sort of see what trouble they can get into.
Ken?
I think of the world as another character for my books, so I do them in conjunction together. And the way I build characters, or think about characters, is I think about the way we build ourselves up. I mean, the way we grow is we accumulate stories that end up giving content to our ideals. We're not born into the world knowing what love means, what courage means. We see examples of our loved ones demonstrating these qualities to us. So that's how my characters sort of are built up. I think about what stories they go through that define what love means to them, what courage means to them, what honor means to them. You can't just say the character is honorable and cares a great deal about patriotism. That means nothing. What are the stories that gave them content, gave these ideals content for the characters? That's how I think about how to build up a character, and that's how I think about how to build up a world too. A world means nothing unless you have stories happening, telling people what these things actually mean. That's how I think about it.
I feel like that actually leads in well to my next question, which is, once you have the basics in place, how do you sort of go about adding depth to your character and making sure they're well-rounded and they're not coming off as flat or a stereotype? And let's start with SL this time.
Sure. One thing that I definitely try to do with all of my characters is not default. And what I mean by that, just to use a sort of simplified example of in pop culture, you know, maybe for like if you have a main protagonist, rugged cop character, maybe the default image that would pop into people's heads would be like a 40-something-ish white man, you know, who's straight and has, you know, is only interested in women and is, you know, never questioned his sexuality or anything. And you know, that's what we see a lot in pop culture, and you know, almost every TV show that stars an archetype of that sort, you know, the character sort of looks like that. And I think it's very easy to fall into those thought patterns, and not just in terms of like aspects of identity and demographic, but in, you know, all aspects of identity. It's very easy to default to, well, of course, this character has to come from this background. So I try really hard to question the things that I'm not questioning and question those assumptions and say, well, am I actually making this decision actively to create this aspect of the character? And if I'm just assuming it, you know, do I want that, and actually decide one way or the other, rather than just falling into the tropes that I have grown up with and inculcated from culture.
Rachel?
In order to get to know my characters, I find myself writing a lot of scenes that never see the light of day, that are just, sorry, we're getting some noise. I don't know where that's
Yeah,
coming.
I'm getting it too.
Okay, sorry, I hope it wasn't me.
Hold on, let me see if it's
okay.
All right, it's
I don't know.
I hear you now.
Okay, but I end up writing a lot of scenes that never see the light of day, where I just put the character into a really mundane situation, or I put them with another character, and or I have a conversation with them myself. A lot of my process actually happens while I'm walking the dog, or while I'm doing something, riding my bike, doing something where I can't actually write anything down. My brain decides it's like, it's time to do fun things, and because it knows I can't record it. And so, but then I'll have conversations with, you know, and really come to know what their idiosyncrasies are, and what, you know, their individualities are, and kind of fall in love with them, for lack of a better way of putting it. And for me, that to me is what makes them individuals. Like, I can't, like, once you fall in love with someone, they can't be generic. You want to know all the facets, and they have facets, and you know, it's harder with secondary characters. With the main character, for me is always pretty much, I kind of know from the beginning. I know them, but secondary characters are easy to make flat, like SL was talking about. And so, but having to sit down and have hard conversations with them as well, which it takes time. And there are days when I'm like, I don't want to spend all this time, but the book is a lot better for taking the time. And so I think it's really worth doing. All right, move on to Ken.
I guess for me, it depends a lot on what the purpose I'm trying to accomplish is. I mean, for example, I actually don't think every character needs depth. In the same way that when you look at a scene, your attention is on certain things and other things fade away, and that actually highlights the thing you're trying to focus on. And I sort of think about that a lot when I'm writing. Sometimes it's helpful to deliberately flatten some characters to give depth to others if you are interested in achieving a specific effect. For me also, one thing I keep in mind when I'm trying to build up characters and give them depth, if that's what I want to do, is to think about the idea that that life is messy, and art, to be plausible, also needs to be messy. I think there's too much emphasis sometimes in craft discussions about consistency, about creating a coherent whole, but people are complicated. Real people are not, in fact, coherent. They don't always make sense. They do surprising things that you don't expect them to do. It doesn't always have to make sense, and I add some of that into my art. You know, the idea that fiction has to be very artificial and isn't like life. There's some truth to that, but it's not 100% true. You can't make your characters perfect to be consistent. That there has to be some messiness to it to give it depth, to give it some sense that you can't fully grasp them. And I like that. So that's what I try to do.
So I want to sort of circle back to something Rachel said in terms of you sometimes approach your secondary characters differently than your primary characters, which makes sense. And I'm wondering, in general, if you all approach your characters a little bit differently depending on the role they play in the story, in terms of whether you're building an antagonist or a protagonist or a sidekick. And what you do in terms of sort of providing contrast within those characters to make sure that, say, your antagonist isn't just purely evil and your protagonist isn't just purely saintly good. And also sort of where you find the balance on the spectrum between, you know, making sure your characters are relatable, but whether or not they're actually likable, if that makes sense. And I guess we'll start with Rachel, since I'm sort of building off, you know, what you said about approaching different characters.
Likable. You said the word likable. That's such a loaded term for me, because
Yeah.
that is like people's number one complaint. They're like, get through the first chapters, like, I don't like her. Like, well, right. She doesn't like herself either. So it's, you know, you're in this together. But, not everybody sees it that way. I do have to say that a villain who is purely evil is absolutely tedious to me, and I can't think how to. I don't know how I would even do that. I always have to understand them and find, for lack of a better word, the part of myself that is the villain. Right? I think of writing as being kind of like dreaming, that every character that who isn't just a background, every character who is represents some part of yourself, even if it's a very tiny part that just gets expanded into a whole person. And so the villain has to also be me at some level, and has to be understandable to me, and has to be sympathetic to me. And the main character, you know, can be kind of a jerk, and but she's a jerk the way I'm a jerk, right? You know, and so you have to understand that part of them too, and really and love it too, and you know, really dig into it and be honest. And so making them complicated, I think it just makes you, the writer, have to be interested in what you're doing, and if the characters are interesting, then I'm interested, and I'm, you know, I hope the reader is too. So I don't know who wants to go next.
SL?
I would say no matter whether it's a primary or secondary characters, you know, not the walk-ons who are there for one line, but anybody who has a significant part in the story, I do approach them pretty much the same. There's a sort of saying, everybody's the hero of their own story.
Mm-hmm.
And I do subscribe to that. And I also, as part of a brainstorming technique, either if I'm stuck or if I'm trying to figure out character, I will write, I call them fanfic on my own work. I will write like cutscenes from like non-POV characters in their heads that I know will never go in the book, but just figuring out what they're thinking and what they're looking towards in that moment. And that helps me, you know, write through and figure out what's happening in the scene, even if we're not going to be in their head in the scene in the book. And you know, I love doing this sort of spin-off stuff. Maybe I'll even write, you know, spin-offs of my own books in some form. And I want all of my characters to feel whole enough to support that if I get there. And as for relatability and likability, like Rachel, I tend to write very unlikable characters. I mean, you know, they kind of commit a little too much murder to be, you know, strictly likable, I would say. Um, I think what Ken was saying about complexity and the messiness of humanity is that really rings true for me. Certainly, I would hope that none of us are messy enough to be like going around, you know, being indiscriminate assassins or something like that. But sort of extrapolating from the push and pull of different parts of ourselves that are, you know, not always maybe the best people. I mean, I know I'm not always the best person, and having each of those, even the villains, be the heroes of their own story and believe in their motivations. But I wouldn't say that every character comes from me necessarily in my personal writing experience, but they certainly all come from my experience. For example, the fantasy I have upcoming has a lot of exploration of abusive and manipulative people who aren't even necessarily antagonists in the story. They're relationships that my protagonists are grappling with, because abuse can be so difficult, especially when you also love the person. And you know, I would hope I don't have any aspects of that kind of manipulative abuse and gaslighting in me, and I don't think I do. But I've certainly experienced it, and have spent a lot of time living in that space of trying to find empathy with that relationship, and for myself as well. So all of it does come from me in some way. I agree.
For me, I really believe this idea that everybody is the hero of their own story. I mean, that's sort of a really guiding principle for a lot of what I do. And the way I put that into practice for my characters is I draw back on my experience when I was a practicing attorney. I got to talk to a lot of people. And one thing you end up learning is that everybody actually has a pretty fascinating story, no matter how boring superficially it might seem. You know, they could have the most superficially simple suburban life with, you know, a boring job like insurance salesperson or being a tax lawyer. But when you go talk to them a little bit about what they do, it turns out that it's full of fascinating little things that you never thought of. Even in something like insurance sales and insurance contracts, or how tax codes are drafted and how regulations are implemented, turns out that there are all kinds of interesting little things that reveal human nature. Politics everywhere, conspiracies, jealousy, ambition, even in something like, again, insurance sales. Like, if you really want to dive into it, there's fascinating human stories everywhere. And so I think about that and I keep that in mind. So even if my character is nothing more than a low-level bureaucrat in the imperial bureaucracy, you know, they have fascinating stories. You know, I've actually written a whole story for Star Wars that's really about one of the desk clerks on the Imperial Star Destroyer. And you know, I had a lot of fun, because turns out when you go deep into someone, they always have fascinating stories. And so even for the minor secondary characters, you can make their lives compelling and interesting, just by keeping that in mind and drawing on what gets them going.
So it looks like we're starting to get some audience questions coming in Discord. So I'm going to flip over to that and ask some of those questions. And I see a question here that I'm going to start with is, how far do you go to build a character? Do you give them a first and last name, a background, experiences, likes and dislikes, or does it depend on the story and what it needs? And I don't know if one or the other of you would like to jump in first to answer that question.
I'll say a few things. I've never found the traditional practice of D&D character building where you describe them and give them hobbies and so on helpful at all. It just, that to me, I've never gotten to know anyone that way, and it doesn't seem to help me get to know my characters any better. What I've done is I actually don't care about how they look. I rarely describe my characters in any detail because I don't think that matters. What matters to me often is what do they do? So when I think about building up a character, I go back to that thing I said earlier. What are their stories? How did they get to be who they are? What are the stories that gave content to words like loyalty, faith, honor, courage? These abstract words, what do they mean to that person? What were the stories that gave those words mean for that person? And then I go from there. Once I've had a few defining stories for that person, I feel like I've gotten a handle on the character, and it worked for me. That's what I do.
I agree with Ken. I work much the same way. I like what you said, Ken, about the feeling like you're getting to know somebody in real life. I feel like I sort of think about it that way as well, in that it's not so much that I don't feel like I need to know the minutia of a character. I feel like I need to understand the spirit of who they are. I feel like that sounds a little corny, but there are a few key points that I need to, in order to get going with the plot or whatever I'm doing. But as the story goes on, I can find out more about them as the other characters are interacting with them, and that works just fine for me. And I keep notes as I'm writing about each of the characters, but usually I don't even need to refer to them because I feel like I'm sort of getting to know this character. And usually as the story unfolds, they become even more fleshed out as I find out more things in the writing about them. And those aren't always the same things. It's not like I know the favorite color of every single character, right? It's more that if something comes up for that character that's core to them and that's important to them, I will find that out in the creative process. So that's how I do it.
Yeah, I agree. I think I tend to build the character as I'm writing. I feel like I start out with kind of an emotional core or a philosophical core even, and that's all I have. But then that core goes out into the world and interacts with things, and then you begin to, it's kind of like a snowball getting bigger and bigger, rolling down the hill. It accumulates things, and I learn as I go. And then sometimes I do have to go back and make sure that, because by the time you start writing a book, you get to the end of the book is huge, right? The book, like, you're a different person by the time you're at the end of the book. The character is also a better, bigger person by the end of the book. And so then you kind of do have to go back and massage it and say, okay, make sure she had her whole past real for her from the beginning. But when you're starting out, it's hard to have all that before you get going, right? And so it's sort of a chicken and egg problem, I guess. But you solve it by doing rather than by sitting and contemplating it, at least for me. I will say though that a thing I have done that is a little bit odd, but that has sometimes helped, and I don't usually do it at the beginning, but I'll be in the middle somewhere, is I used to be a cartoonist, so this maybe comes more naturally to me. I'll sit and draw the character, and as I'm drawing, the lines themselves will suggest things to me that I didn't know before. And I don't know, it's like it sounds a little woo-woo, and I'm sorry, but I found that that's a tool that can help me solidify the character if they're still feeling kind of amorphous. So
that's so cool.
But it doesn't tell me what their favorite color is. That really never comes up. I don't know anybody's favorite color. I'm sorry.
That's a very cool approach, though. So I saw two other questions come in that, to my mind, are a little bit related. One is, how quickly do you establish a character in a short story? And then the other question, I saw somebody asking for tips and tricks to really engage readers or make them fall in love with a character or get them invested in a character right from chapter 1 of your novel. I feel like those two questions feed into each other a little bit in terms of, boom, right off the bat. Or maybe that's not the way you approach short stories. So feel free to dissect those questions any way you choose.
I do not write short stories as a rule because
Okay.
I find them impossibly hard. So maybe my other panelists will know a thing or two here.
Actually do not approach those the same way at all, which now that you and the questioner in Discord have said it, I find really interesting to think about, because I find when I'm introducing a character in a novel, a lot of times what makes the character engaging enough to me to drive that novel forward and to support the weight of this potential long form story is that there's so much that we don't know about them, like that they have such a large problem, or there's something so gripping that we don't know about at all, or something about their personality. Like there are all these unanswered questions that I feel like are able to sort of support that journey. So a lot of times in a novel, at the beginning, I am trying to introduce something that is this larger world and the way the world intersects with the character, and in a way that I don't do in shorts at all, I don't think. A lot of my shorts they're more idea focused. And I think the characters in my shorts tend to be a little bit more in conversation with the idea that the short is about, because my novels are usually about like many things and many ideas and many adventures and stuff like that. But if it's like one concentrated idea that I'm working on, I want each of the characters and what we see of them right away to be in conversation with that. But I don't think I do that consciously. But Ken is the master of the short form, so I'm very interested in seeing what he has to say on this.
I have to confess, I've had a little bit of a crisis in terms of writing short stories, because before I wrote my epic fantasies, I only wrote short stories, and so I was very at home with them. But after I wrote the big epic fantasies, now I think like 15,000 words is not enough to introduce a character. So how can you tell a story? It's just impossible. Anyway, so I've had multiple instances where I was given a word limit and I wrote way past it. So, I don't feel like I'm necessarily a very good person to give advice on this anymore. I will say, in terms of tips and tricks, one thing that has worked for me of getting readers right on the side of someone is to think back to all the gangster dramas and crime shows that we love watching. These are not people you want to sit down and have a beer with, whatever that means. But you often care about them. Why? And the reason it happens is because almost right away you show these characters in passionate pursuit of something. I think we human beings are wired to be empathetic to somebody really wanting something and working hard to get at it. They can be incompetent at it. They can be really good at it. They can be what they want doesn't actually matter in some ways. They could be thieves trying to steal national treasure. And if you just start out showing them passionately pursuing that thing, giving it all, audiences almost always just root for them, just go into it, because we just love that. We love seeing people fight hard, passionately for whatever it is they want, even if it's something that abstractly will be like, whoa, that is not a cool thing at all. But that's one way we enjoy these stories.
Actually, that's really interesting. I really enjoyed hearing you say that, because I think that's part of my problem, is that my approach to character tends to be really get into them. And by the time I've really gotten into a character, gotten to know them really well, there's too much to say. You cannot fit that in a short story. And so you really kind of have to start from a different and not get so deep into it. So thank you for saying that. I have thoughts now.
May completely revolutionize your approach. So we have a question here about revision. During revision, what kinds of things do you do to tweak in the characters themselves, and what do you focus on?
This actually kind of goes back to what Ken was saying about short stories, actually, that at least for me in revisions, I have to make it absolutely clear what the character wants all the way along. And that's the thing that in my own, as I'm writing in process, I know what the character wants, and I feel like it's really obvious, but it isn't always obvious to the reader. And so a lot of times that needs to be kind of seeded back in, that just a little more clarity at any given moment to kind of check in. What are we going for? Oh yeah, Other than that, I mean, revision is forever, and I love doing it. I like revising much more than composing, so I actually recommend it highly. Several passes, just get it, because each time you do it, the story gets deeper. I like to think of it like tempera painting in the Renaissance, where they would put down a single translucent layer of paint and let it dry, then put down another translucent layer of paint and let it dry. And it took forever, but it built up these layers and until it was absolutely transparently crystalline, beautiful painting. I think of the work that way too, that it just takes time and passes, and so.
I'm the complete. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, Lisa, go.
I'm the complete opposite of you in my preferences in that I much prefer drafting, but I do agree that revision's important and building that in. And I do the same thing Rachel does in going back and making sure I have that, I'm seeding that motivation that maybe I started to discover more deeply later on and showing it from the beginning. But I often find I don't need that much character revision if I've got that sort of spirit of the character we were talking about from the beginning. Because even if I have to change small details and try to like make their arc a little more consistent, or change some things for those consistency purposes with who I discover who they are later, usually if I nail that from the beginning, which is really helpful to my process to sort of know that core of them, then my characters tend not to go through too many editing changes. Sometimes secondary characters a little more, but usually only if I need to change something in the plot. Like if something's really wrong in the plot, sometimes I'll completely rewrite a secondary character, because for me, character always drives the plot, and that helps me change the structure of the book if I've completely changed a character. Other than that, I don't alter them fundamentally, I don't think.
So to what Rachel said earlier really resonated with me when she said that, sometimes the way characters build up is you learn about them as you go along, and you kind of have to go back and make sure that those later things you discover are reflected earlier so that it becomes consistent. That to me is really the point of revision. So I think of revisions as the way by which we authors appear to be much smarter than we actually are. That's where the magic happens. And so I really love revisions, because this is where I get to create the illusion that I know what I'm doing. And I think the pleasure of fiction a lot of times is discovering patterns, right? So you read on page 5 some tiny detail that on page 905 comes full cycle and becomes useful. It's the Chekhov's pistol idea, right? But the thing is, when you're drafting, you don't always know to plant those things or keep them, tickling the same thing over several times until you get there. Readers may read 2 chapters in quick succession, or they may read chapter 1 on day 1 and then chapter 60 on day 2, so that they have that fresh in their mind. So these layers come together and they see the pattern and they're like, oh my god, this is so smart, what a great idea, great plot, wow. But when I'm writing those 2 chapters are drafted a year apart. By the time I got there, I can't possibly remember that, especially if you're the sort of writer who does not outline and carefully plan those things out ahead of time. So revisions are where I get to do that. So I do use keywords to mark my chapters, and later on I go through it to make sure that I plant things. When I'm doing revisions, I'm really just thinking, okay, here's a story, it needs to be echoed here, this is what's going to happen later, so I need to plant something here to just keep the reader's mind alert to the fact that this will come back and become important. So you do these little craft level things, and they seem very silly, very simple when you're doing them, almost trivial, but just like any kind of art, these little things matter a lot to creating the final illusion that there's a coherent, thoughtful, planned artwork here. So that's how I think about revisions. It's where I go and do the stuff to make it magical.
I just want to say, because I just feel like Ken will appreciate this, my motto in writing actually is, my brain is smarter than I am, meaning that as you're doing it, there is stuff coming out from your subconscious and you don't even know why you're putting it in there the first time through, and you're just putting it in there, and then afterwards you go through and you're like, oh, look what I did. I have a theme going on, but then in revisions, then you bring it out so people can see it besides just you. So yes, that's my approach as well.
This is only slightly related, but since we're talking about character, there's this thing I love that I've heard people say, that the way to write a character who's smarter than you are, who's like a super genius, is to spend 3 days working out the solution this character needs and then have them think of it in 3 minutes in the narrative.
Nice. Okay, so we have a question here about a specific method. Do any of you use the screenwriter technique of finding out what the character's fundamental wound usually an unresolved issue or traumatic event in their formative years is, and build layers around that. And if not, that's fine too.
Yeah, I don't use that one. I use some screenwriting techniques. I like the Save the Cat books, and I find I don't use everything from them sort of verbatim, but I do find those extremely helpful for some structure and tips and stuff, but not that particular screenwriting tool, sorry.
I don't know from screenwriting rules, so I don't know. I wouldn't have, but I always do know what their wound is. But when you get to know them really well, that's one of the things you eventually get to know. I mean, sometimes it can take them some time to trust you with it, but yeah, with this book, in fact, this was originally going to be a happy-go-lucky, like fluffy road trip. She was just going to go out on the road and have a, road trip adventure with her, gender fluid lizard pal. And but then it turned, in my own just life, things kept nudging me and like, hey, what about this? And there's a story that I hadn't told about abuse and sexual assault. And I was like, no, I don't want her to have to go through. And yet it kept coming back. And I realized finally, okay, you know what? I think this is the story that needs to be told. And I was very sad because I want it to be fluffy. It's as fluffy as I could make it. But yeah, so in that case, that was like my issue coming through, and yet it was actually a really good vehicle for figuring out a way to tell that story. So sometimes I think it can come, look at the character's wound. The character's wound is sometimes your wound, and if you're ready to tell that story, then that can be a good way to do it. Also, though, just fair warning: digging into your own trauma can make your trauma come camp out in your backyard, which I didn't realize. Apparently, that's a well-known psychological phenomenon. And so, if I could do it all over again, I'd have the therapist lined up beforehand. But it was still an interesting journey that way.
Ken, did you have anything to add to that? Or?
No, nothing.
Okay. So the next question is, how do you handle diversity in your characters, or how do you approach characters, put yourself in their mindset if they have a very different background from you? And whoever wants to jump in first, feel free.
Carefully and respectfully, and with beta readers who know a thing or two and can inform you how to proceed and what you're doing. But also, I feel like the whole falling in love with the characters things helps too. That it's hard to treat someone as a stereotype or a cipher if you love them, and so it takes work and it takes time, it takes research, and care and a willingness to listen. I don't know. Other people can talk.
This is an incredibly hard topic. I'm a woman, I'm Chinese American, I'm queer, I'm genderqueer. I struggle with health and disability issues. Like many of these, you could list aspects of identity in which I'm a minority. Any one of those, I'm so far from being an expert of speaking on behalf of like a huge group of people, and yet I care about these issues so much. I care about representation in books and movies. Growing up, it was important to me to see people who looked like me in media, and I try so hard to do that in my work. And there's also the, like we were talking about before, and like Ken was saying in one of the first answers, humans are so messy. Right, and then there's sort of the perception of how to write a character who is X demographic correctly, and say it's a demographic that I identify with, and I look at that and I'm like, wow, I'm a really bad queer person or whatever because I don't fit that. I'm messier than that, and I think a lot of us are, and we have these discussions in intra-community spaces, like in POC spaces and in queer spaces, where we talk about writing identities that are our own identities and feeling like we're, getting things wrong because we want to talk about the messiness in some way. And, and because people aren't a monolith, and my experiences are not going to be the experiences of somebody else who shares all of my identity labels, like that, not even close, right? I think the first story I wrote that starred any Chinese people, or fantasy Chinese in this case, I spent more time and research on that story than I had of anything else I'd written so far, because I was so scared of getting it wrong. And this is, you know, this is my culture, and I had grown up with a lot of aspects of this, but like of feeling like, you know, do I have the right to be writing this in some way, and insecurities about that, and you know, somehow doing a disservice. I don't know. There's a lot of emotional stuff, but I feel like it's very important, and it's very important to showcase people who are different from me. Also, you know, it's not just going to be the cabal of half Asian queer women saving the world every single time. So, you know, I definitely, you know, put a lot of diversity and a lot of work into my characters. And one thing that really helps me, and to answer the question about writing people who are different from me, is listening to people. You know, I follow a lot of people on, you know, social media of, you know, from so many different walks of life, and that is just so incredibly helpful in expanding my worldview, and being friends with people in real life as well, you know, and also reading the nonfiction and fiction writing and the creations of, you know, people who come from other walks of life than you. That is also incredibly helpful for me in you know, questioning my assumptions and realizing, you know, where all these axes of experience that, you know, maybe I never even knew to ask about. I think all of that comes together, and, you know, like Rachel was saying, having, you know, great beta readers and crypt partners and stuff. But it is a very hard topic, and I don't think there are easy answers to this. It's just, you know, trying my best and trying to do it respectfully, and knowing that, you know, it's an important thing, and you know, doing as well as I can.
I just want to quickly note we've got about 5 minutes left. So Ken, I want to give you a chance to answer the question and then maybe get closing thoughts from all of you.
So I was just going to say, repeat all the things that Rachel and Lisa said, especially about just listening to other people. I would recommend writing the other book and seminar series. I think they're really helpful. I would also say one more thing, which is take a step back, right? There's a lot of, I totally share what Lisa said about the emotional fraughtness of doing representation and diversity, and it's just really, really difficult. But the thing that I found to be of some comfort is to take a step back and think about why it is that no one has any kind of angsty thoughts about doing straight white male representation correctly. Well, the reason we don't, there are many, but at least one of them is that there are so many examples of them. What I think of is what I want to focus on is diversity is a collective quality. It is not a singular thing. You cannot write a diverse character, a single one. You cannot be a single diverse author, whatever that means. You cannot have a single panel on diversity, however inclusive you wish it to be. You just can't. It's not a singular thing. Everyone is unique and special in a literal sense, not in a trivial kumbaya sense. You really are a unique accumulation of stories. And so the only way to show true diversity is to have many, many, many examples. So the best thing you can do is to promote more and more and more, rather than striving to be the best of the intersection of XYZ identities and doing it right. I'm not saying that's not a good effort. Do it in a way that's true to you, but maybe more helpful things is to simply promote more of XYZ voices, period, and get all of them to talk, so that no single book must represent everything that you care about, and no single character must be a stand-in for everyone who happens to be in your community. Just promote more. That I think is more helpful than anything else.
Huge +1 to all of that. Huge agree.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we've got 3 minutes left, which gives each of you a minute for a closing thought or anything you want to shout out or anything like that. So Rachel, go.
I just want to say thanks everybody for organizing this. This has been such a giant effort, and I've met so many interesting people, and I'm really pleased to have met everyone here on this panel, and I'm excited to, I don't know, it kind of gives you some life to want to go back out and get working, and it's nice to feel this community across space and time here.
SL?
Totally agreed. Thank you so much, AC and Ken and Rachel. This was a super fun panel. And thank you to all of our audience in the Discord for such great questions and for coming and listening to us for this panel.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for this great panel, and thank you to the audience for just participating. We have a lot of people. I'm sort of amazed and chatting and talking about it. And I hope all of you get to tell the stories you want to tell, and have a great rest of the con.
Oh my gosh, 170 people? Wow, we do have a huge audience. Hi, thank you.
Well, thank you all for being such wonderful panelists. Gary, thank you for being a great facilitator. Thank you, audience, for all your wonderful questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to every single one of them, but we appreciate you coming out and learning from our wonderful panelists. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of the con. And thank you very, very much.